speaks to the conversation we were just having, right? So there should be something within the question you're working on that you can answer, okay? You know, there's always going to be multiple levels to the question, and there might be a part that you really don't understand, but that doesn't mean that you can't get a really, really good score. Good. So I'm going to share my screen with all of you, and we'll take a look at 2016, okay? All right, so this question, I called it the string formatter question. So when I made my replit, called it the string formatter class, okay? And we're told, it says this question involves the process of taking a list of words called word list and producing a formatted string of a specified length. The word list contains at least 2 words, consisting of letters only. When the formatted string is constructed, spaces are placed in the gaps between words so that as many spaces as possible are evenly distributed to each gap. The equal number of spaces inserted into each gap is referred to as the basic gap width. Any leftover spaces are inserted one at a time into the gaps from left to right until there are no more leftover spaces. The following 3 examples illustrate these concepts. In each example, the list of words is to be placed into a formatted string of length 20. So we're given this first example, AP Comp Sci Rocks, which has a total of 14 letters, okay? Now, one thing that I hope you picked up on right away is that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 words in the list. The number of gaps between words is 3. And we'll come back to this information in a bit, all right? If we go down to the second example, we can also see there are 4 words, 3 gaps. And in the third example, we have 2 words and 1 very large gap, okay? So the first thing that comes to mind is that the number of gaps between words is going to be equal to word list dot size minus 1. So the number of gaps, right? We want to think about how we can write code to calculate each one of these pieces of information, which we are going to have to do. So in fact, the total number of letters in the words in the word list, that's the method that we're going to be writing for part A. The basic gap width was the method we wrote in part B. I wrote my own leftover spaces method, as some of you may have as well, for part C, because in part C we're told that there is a leftover spaces method and we're told how it works, but we don't actually get to see the code for it, okay? And then in order to calculate basic gap width, we have to know how many total spaces there are. So in calculating basic gap width, this piece of information here will be used as well, okay? So use the examples they give you. I know it's a lot of information to process in a short period of time, but we have to use all of the information they give us to sort of dissect the question, okay? So let's go ahead and, well, let's take a look at each example again real quick. So we have our 4 words. We have 14 letters in total. There's 20 spaces. Notice we have 2 spaces, 2 spaces, 2 spaces. Our basic gap width is 2. Leftover spaces is 0. Okay, let's see if it's any different for this question or this example. 2 spaces, 2 spaces, 1 space. So the basic gap width is 1, and the leftover spaces is 2. So we can think of it in terms of GREEN, green, was put into each one of those positions, then a space, then EGGS for eggs, then a space, then AND for and, then a space, and then HAM, ham, and then nothing, okay? Then you go back and you fill in the leftover spaces after you've inserted the word, the basic gap with the next word, the basic gap with the next word, basic gap with the next word. And then once you're done with that, then you fill in the leftover spaces. So keep that in mind as we approach part C to this question, okay? All right, so part A, they give us an additional example where we have a frog is, which has a total of 7 letters. So string formatter dot total letters words, which is the name of the list, this list here, should return 7. Okay, so our objective here is we have a list which is a parameter of the method. We know that word list dot get I, assuming I is the index, will retrieve the object from the list. Now, each object happens to be a string. We know that there's a length method that belongs to the string class that, when invoked on a string, counts how many characters there are in the string. So all we have to do here is introduce a variable, some type of counter variable, which I happen to call sum. You may have called it total or count, whatever you want, where we initialize it to 0. We loop through the entire list, and each iteration, each time through the loop, we retrieve an element from the list. We then invoke the length method on that string object, which counts the letters. We add that integer amount to the integer variable sum, and we continue to do that until there are no more elements in the list. Okay, so actually fairly straightforward, and I've written 2 implementations to part A, one with a for each loop, the other with a for loop. So let's take a look at each one of those. All right, let's take a look at what I have written second, which is what I was really just speaking to, using the .get method. So we have this sum variable here, which comes before the loop, of course, initialized, declared and initialized as an integer and assigned to the value of 0. So we have just a very standard for loop header where we're starting at position 0, and we want to loop from left to right, encompassing each and every element in the list. So int I is assigned to 0, I is less than wordlist.size, I++. So the sum is going to be assigned to sum plus wordlist.getI retrieves the object from the list, which is a string, dot length calculates the length of the string. We then add that to the previous sum, which now becomes the new sum, and we continue to do this. So we loop through, we continue to do this until there are no more elements or no more objects in the list, and then finally when we exit the loop, we will return the sum. Okay? Now we can also do this using a for each loop. The reason we can use a for each loop here is because we're not reassigning the elements in the list. We don't need to reference the index at any point. So we're not, if this method had something to do with returning the index of a specific element, then we wouldn't be able to use a for each loop. But all we're doing here is taking each element, we're calculating the length of each element, which happens to be a string in the list. We're adding that to a sum, and then we're returning the sum when the list is, or when the list is been exhausted, when we've completely gone through the list. So we can say string element. So for each string element in the word list, add sum. Add the length of the element to the previous sum, which gets reassigned as the new sum. And again, when we're finished with the loop, we return what's stored in the sum variable. Okay? Somebody had a question or a comment. Could you have created a new string that contains all the elements without any space and use the length method to find the length of the string to find the number of letters? Could you have created a new string that contains all the elements? Yeah, I suppose you could, Jay. But as Tamim and Jesswinder point out, it's just a little bit extra work. I don't think you would have lost any credit. It's just you just creating a little bit extra work for yourself. That's all. Okay. So this is definitely the easiest way to do it. I mean, you can see very, very compact, very straightforward. A standard, very simple for loop. There's no conditional statements. There's no nested loops or anything like that. So it's very, very straightforward. You get the element, you calculate the length of that element, which is a string, you add it to a variable, and you return that variable as soon as the loop is done. Okay? Now let's take a look at my main method. So I have array list string. I've called it word list 1 is assigned to new array list string. I've added AP comp sci rocks to word list 1. I've then said system.out print ln. Word list 1 has 14 letters. We know that. I mean, we can count it ourselves, or we can use it. We can use the example given. We're told right here, 14 letters. Okay. So when I invoke the method that I've just written the implementation for, it should return the number 14. So word list 1 has 14 letters. Letters counted using method concatenated with. So string formatter. String formatter, of course, is the name of my class. This is a static method. So in order to use it here, we have to invoke the class name, or we have to use the class name first, and then the method name, followed by, of course, the parameter, which is word list 1. If I go ahead and run this, we will see that it does, in fact, return the number 14. So part A, word list 1 has 14 letters. Letters counted using the method, 14. Word list 2, green eggs and ham, has 15 letters. Letters counted using the method, 15. So it seems to be working quite well here. Okay? Any questions about part A before we move on? Any other questions about part A before we move on to part B? I would just copy and paste it, Jesswinder. I think the screenshot sounds like more work. All right, moving on to part B. Now, part B, I spent probably more time thinking about this question than I needed to. And sometimes, sometimes the solutions for questions that only require one line of code can be the hardest ones, sometimes. So it took me a minute to break this down, to really think about the basic gap width. Maybe some of you were able to figure it out more quickly than I was. But in any case, hopefully you figured out some type of relationship between all these numbers here. So the length of the formatted string is 20. Okay? So the total number of letters in the word is 14. 20 minus 14 is 6. So there are 6 total empty spaces. Okay? There are 6 total empty spaces. And we know that the number of gaps will be 3 because there are 4 words. And we said previously that the number of gaps between words is simply the word list dot size minus 1. Okay? So how do we then figure out the basic gap width given that information? So let's go ahead and take a look. And I wrote some notes in here as well. So the basic gap width is simply the average number of blank spaces between letters in the list. That's not entirely accurate. So it's the basic gap width is the average number of blank spaces between letters in the list prior to adding leftovers. Okay? Prior to adding the leftovers. All right. So the solution given on the AP website, they just returned they had one line of code in the body of the method. And I could have accomplished the same here, but I broke this down by first thinking to myself, okay, what or how rather can I calculate the number of gaps? And as I said, that's simply the word list.size minus 1. Now the total number of empty spaces is the formatted len, which is 20. I don't even know why they bother making it a variable here. I think just to add another level of complexity, but the formatted len is always going to be 20 as we're told in the problem. So formatted len minus total letters, right? Total letters is the method we just wrote, and we're told in part B, so if we go down to part B, we're told that in order to receive full credit, you have to make a call to the total letters method. You must use total letters appropriately to receive full credit, okay? So that should give you a hint that the total letters has some type of relationship in calculating the basic width. So formatted len, which is 20, minus total letters word list. So for the example AP Comp Sci rocks, that would be 20 minus 14, which is 6. So the number of empty spaces, which is 6, divided by the number of gaps, which is 3, will give us the number 2. 6 divided by 3 is 2. That's our basic gap width. Now, we are performing here integer division, and that's important. So that's why it's evenly distributed, the spaces. And then whatever's left over will be assigned after the fact, after the basic gap widths are inserted, okay? So with that said, if we take a look at the leftover spaces method that I wrote, we're also going to incorporate the number of gaps, wordlist.size minus 1. The basic gap width is calculated. So I have a variable called basic gap width, which is assigned to basic gap width, word list, comma, formatted len, just taking these parameters here. Empty spaces is the number of gaps. So we're doing the inverse of what we saw in the basic gap width method. So empty spaces is going to be the number of gaps times the basic gap width. And the leftover spaces is the total letters, so how many letters there were, plus the empty spaces taken away from the formatted len, okay? So the total number of letters was 14. The number of empty spaces was, hang on a second, number of gaps. So for the example we were doing, the number of gaps was 3, the basic gap width was 2, so that's 6. So our empty spaces was 6. Total letters, 14, empty spaces, 6. We add those two together, we get 20. 20 minus 20 is 0, which of course makes sense. If we go back up, we can take a look at in our chart, leftover spaces is 0, okay? Now in the second example, the leftover spaces was 2. The leftover spaces was 2. So really what you're seeing here, despite seeing 2 spaces at position 5 and 6, position 11 and 12, there's only 1 space at 16. The basic gap width must be the same between each word. So the basic gap width is really 1. All right, and then the leftover spaces would technically be at position 6 and index 12. Okay, so let's calculate it using this example here. So for green eggs and ham, there's 15 letters. Okay, there's 15 total letters. the number of empty spaces, which is number of gaps, so that's 3, times the basic gap width, which is 1. 3 times 1 is 3. So we have 15 plus 3, which is, 15 plus 3, which is 18. 20 minus 18 is 2. And I tested out the leftover spaces method, and you can see that right here. I also tested out the basic gap width method, and I'll show you that in the main in just a second. So part B, system.out print ln basic gap width should be 2 and is string formatter dot basic gap width word list 1. So that was for AP Comp Sci Rocks. Of course, there are going to be 20 total spaces from index value 0 up to index value 19. And that worked out perfectly. Basic gap width should be 2 and is 2. Then for the second word list, which was green eggs and ham, basic gap width should be 1 and is returned 1. And then finally for beach ball, the basic gap width should be 11 and is 11. Okay? And then I tested out my leftover spaces method, which you didn't have to do. I simply wanted to do that so that I could write my format method and test it appropriately. Okay? So if you didn't write a leftover spaces method, that's perfectly fine. You just wouldn't have been able to test the format method in an IDE. Okay? And that returned the appropriate integer as well. 0 for word list 1, 2 for word list 2, and 0 for word list 3. Okay? So that's part B, and getting into part C there as well. I think gap returns how many slots a gap take up per gap. Leftover, you could have done modulus. All right, I got to catch up on your comments. Can you explain how word list dot size minus 1 is the number of gaps? Sure, Jin. So let's start with Jin's. If there are 4 words, right, there's got to be at least 1 space between each word. So if there's 4 words, then you only have a space in between, not after each word, in between each word. Okay? So you're going to have the first word, then a space between the first and the second word. Then you have a space between the second and the third word, and then finally you have a space between the third and the fourth word. So again, if there was a space after each word, then the number of spaces or the number of gaps, so to speak, would be equal to word list dot size. But because there's a space in between each word, it has to be 1 fewer than the total number of words, which is word list dot size minus 1. So Matthew kind of answered that there. Is gaps the total number of slots there are? I'm not sure what you mean by that. I would love to see how it could be done using modulus. Not doubting you, just simply curious. Kalindu, it's just 1 gap between 2 words besides the last word. Correct. Our purpose is to fill those words in the formatted len. Yes. Okay. All right. I think I've answered the questions there, but just type in the chat if there's something that you'd like me to address before we move on to part C. Awesome. Great, Jen. Anyone else before we move on? Okay, moving on to part C, which unfortunately was definitely the hardest part of the question. But even so, I still think that if you struggle to get part C 100% correct, I think, or I know that pretty much all of you are capable of getting at least a third of this question correct, okay? So it says, assume the total letters, oh, that was part B. Part C, here we go. Write the string formatter method format, which returns the formatted string as defined earlier. The string formatter class also contains a method called leftovers, which we just reviewed, which has already been implemented. This method returns the number of leftover spaces as defined earlier and is shown below. So there's the leftovers method, and then we got to go to our format method. Okay. So assume that basic gap width works as specified, regardless of what you wrote in part B. You must use basic gap width and leftover spaces appropriately to receive full credit. Complete the method format below. Returns a formatted string consisting of the words and word lists separated by spaces. The word list contains at least 2 words consisting of letters only. Formatted len is large enough for all the words and gaps. All words and word lists appear in the formatted string, so that's the post condition. The words appear in the same order. The number of spaces between words is determined by basic gap width and the distribution of leftover spaces from left to right as described in the question. Okay, so what are we returning? What's our return type? Let's get those easy points. We're returning a string. Okay, we're taking the words from the word list. We're taking the strings from the list, and we are putting them into a string. So first up, we need to declare and initialize a variable, and you could call that variable whatever you want. Result, I'm going to call it format, or formatted rather, and that's going to be just an empty string, not a blank string with a space, an empty string. So open quote, close quote. Now, we're going to have a loop. We need to loop. Anytime you have an array or an array list, some type of loop is going to be involved. We've got to loop through that data structure to retrieve that information and somehow put it into this blank, or rather empty string. Okay? Now, before we started the whole question, I said that you're going to be taking each word, right? So we need to retrieve each string object from the list, and we are going to, so that's step 1. You're going to retrieve a string object from the list, and you're going to take that string and you're going to add it to, or concatenate it to, the empty string. Now, we don't want AP comp sci rocks to be smushed together. We need to account for the basic gap width, and then after we've accounted for the basic gap width, we then have to account for the leftover spaces, okay? So we're going to be looping through the data structure, which will get each element for us. Then we have to appropriately add the correct number of spaces relative to the basic gap width. So we may need a loop there as well. And then we need to include the leftover spaces after we've retrieved a word and we've included the basic gap width, and we've done that for the whole list. Then we go back and we fill in the leftover spaces moving from left to right, which is what we sort of observe in the second example, where there's a leftover space, and then just the basic gap width. Because in example 2, the basic gap width was 1 with 2 leftover spaces. So that's why we had a word, then 2 blank spaces, another word, 2 blank spaces, and then 1 space. Okay? So let's take a look at a solution here. All right, so there's that variable, string formatted, which of course I'm returning at the end of my method. I'm using a loop that loops through the entire data structure. Okay, so even if you just had this, and this, you might have squeaked out a point for just this part C alone. Okay. We're told we have to make a call to the basic gap width and leftover spaces methods appropriately and use that information somewhere in the problem, in the context of the problem. So I don't know that you necessarily earn the point just from what I have here in lines 56 and 57. I think those points get earned when you use them, when you actually use those pieces of data within the loop. But I'd have to go back and double check in the rubric. So the basic gap width takes a word list, formatted len as its two parameters. We're going to store that in a variable called gap width. We're then using the leftovers method, having the same two parameters, and we're going to store that in leftovers. So we have an integer for the gap width, we have an integer for the leftovers. Now, standard for loop, starting from the left, going all the way to the right, incrementing one by one. Here, I decided to use the shorthand. Again, this just means it's the same thing as formatted is assigned to formatted plus wordlist.getI. So I've got my formatted string, which is just this empty thing here. I've retrieved the first word in the list, and I've added it or concatenated it to that empty string. So if we're talking about AP Comp Sci Rocks, it's just AP. Okay, it's just AP after executing this with I is 0 and I is 0 here. Now, if I were to remove this for loop, remove these leftovers, okay, what would happen is AP Comp Sci Rocks would be all smushed together. We have to account for the basic gap width. And it's not like you can you can't retrieve all of the words and put them into the string and then go back and fill in the spaces. I suppose you could, but I think it would be much, much more difficult. And if that's something you did and it worked and you know it worked, you feel free to share it with the group, okay? But I think it would be much more difficult to retroactively fill in the spaces after the whole string is sort of smushed together and there's no spaces at all between each word, okay? So that's why we have a nested loop here. And the reason it's a loop and not a conditional is because the basic gap width, okay, the basic gap width could be 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Okay? And the basic gap width is going to be the same between each word. Okay? Remember, the number of spaces between words may vary, but that's accounted or stored in or represented by the leftover spaces variable. The basic gap width is technically the same between each and every word. So we're going to loop through, all right, we're going to use a loop starting with j is assigned to 0. As long as j is less than the gap width, you will add a space to the formatted string, okay, this formatted string variable that we return later on. So if the basic gap width is 2, we will perform this loop for j is 0 and j is 1, thus adding 2 blank spaces. If the basic gap width was 3, we would do this for j is 0, 1, and 2, and then so on and so forth, okay? Now, after we have retrieved the word and we've inserted the appropriate number of basic gap width spaces, we are going to add a leftover, if any, okay? Now, the reason we're using a conditional here and not a loop is that we add the leftover spaces one by one. So you're not, let's say there were 6 empty spaces. You would add an empty space, then another empty space, and then another empty space, so on and so forth, okay, until you got to the end, and then you'd come back to the beginning, all right? Now, you're never going to have, when I say an even number of leftover spaces, you're never going, not an even number, but you're never going to have a number of leftover spaces that is equal to the number of gaps, okay? Because if that were true, then you'd have this one-to-one relationship, and that number then would be encompassed by the basic gap width. So for example, if you had three spaces, you had 4 words total, that means you're going to have 3 gaps, all right? So if you had a basic gap width of 1, you will have 1 space in between each word. Now, if you had 2 leftover spaces, then you'd fill in that leftover space, then you'd fill in over that leftover space, and then you wouldn't fill in the leftover space because you wouldn't have any left. So you'd have 2 spaces, 1 space. If you had an additional leftover space, then the basic gap width would be 2, okay? So I could see where, Matthew, where you said you decided to use the modulus operator, okay, relative to the basic gap width. So if the leftovers is greater than 0, so if there are any leftovers at all, then you're going to add a space. You're going to take 1 away from leftovers. And again, this is a conditional statement. It's not a loop. So you execute it once, and as soon as when you are finished executing the conditional, we then come back up to the header of our outer for loop. We increment I, we get the next word, we fill in its appropriate basic gap width, and then we fill in any other leftovers if there are any to fill in, okay? And that's that. And we can see right down here, so I'll show you my main method. This was our part C. Okay, I can part C. Got out println, string formatter, format word list 1, word list format word list 2, and format word list 3. Okay. So here it is, part C, AP, and I can count the spaces. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. So that worked out perfectly. There should be 2 spaces between green and eggs. There are 1, 2. There should be 2 spaces between eggs and the word and. 1, 2. And there should be 1 space between and ham, because the basic gap width for this example was 1, and it had 2 leftover spaces. So this first space, represents the basic gap width. This represents the basic gap width. This represents the basic gap width. This second space is your first of 2 leftovers. There's your other leftover, and we're done. And then finally, for the third word list, we have beach ball, which should have a basic gap width of 11. So meaning there should be 11 spaces between these 2 words. It's a little harder to count. Just try to be careful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Terrific. Okay? And that's that. Oh boy, we got some questions here. Questions, comments. Does the method return the correct length? Kalindu. Okay, give me a second. That could be why my method is a little bit different than the one they had. So in the solution, they used word list.size -1. And then they had this extra line here, oh boy, of formatted plus equals word list what was it? Word list.get word list.get word list dot size minus 1. Let me look at the comments again. Clementina, I would consider this a hard question, in my opinion. Part C, I think part A and part B weren't too bad, but I think just the entire question, because there was so much information, I would definitely put this on the hard side. I thought 2016 in general was very difficult, very difficult. I guess using my IDE, Matthew and Kalindu, it's not easy for me to see, right, if I had any spaces after. So given the solution that I had before, which I thought worked 100%, I'll have to go back in and confirm your statement, which is that there was a space at the end. I'm not sure why that would happen. Again, I've just updated it to match precisely what the AP board provided as an appropriate solution, but I thought you'd be able to do it without line 76 and then just simply changing this, getting rid of the -1. So I'm going to have to go back and see, right, it seemingly appears to have the appropriate number of basic gap widths and leftover spaces. But again, that's hard to see exactly if there are spaces after the string as you say there are, okay? You think I got an incorrect length. Oh, I see what you're doing. I see what you're saying, Matthew. Okay, give me a sec. It's a good idea. All right, I'm going to change my solution back to, so I'm going to get rid of this. Actually, I'll just comment it out and bring this back. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go to the main method and let's see. The system.outprint formatted dot length. Let's do, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to store this in a string, word, okay? And we're going to say word.length. All right, so length should be 20 and is. All right, let's see what we get. Hang on a sec, extra parentheses there. Oh boy, okay. Length should be 20 and is 22, so Matthew, you're correct. Let's try it for the others as well. I'll just change this to wordless too. $21. Okay, one more second. And let's do it for wordless 3. Wow. Okay, so that's way off. Like it has 11 more. Okay, so the error seems to be in it's adding an additional basic gap width. Because the first example had 2 more. The next one, so for word list 1, we were off by 2, which happens to be the basic gap width. The second one, we were off by 1. That's the basic gap width. And then the third example, we were off by 11. So if we go back, what were some of the suggestions? Use less than or equal to basic gap width. Got it. So let's see. Let me go back real quick. So I'm adding an additional, so we're getting, that's, okay. We don't want a basic gap width to be added after we've retrieved the last word. I see. That's why they had the -1 and that additional. So what they did was they stopped. Okay. So they have -1 here because they want to stop before the last word. Okay. The basic gap width will be added after the second to last word, but we don't want it added after the last word. And then once we've completed adding all of the words to the string, we're going to bring in this line here in line 76 formatted, which word list.get. So how do we get the last element in any list? Well, the index of the last element in any list is the size of that list -1. So we're going to say word list.get. Word list.size -1 is just an integer that represents the index of the final element in the list. We add that to formatted, and now when we run this, we can see our length is correct. So length should be 20, end is 20. And if I go back and I change this for the second word list, it'll be 20 again. So I'm glad I made the mistake because we can get a better understanding of why we needed to have the code there, so that basic length, or rather the total length, is 20. So thanks for pointing that out, Matthew. Go back here. So once again, we didn't want to add, right? We didn't want to have a basic gap width after the final word. So by having I is less than word list.size -1, we stop adding words from the list 1 word prior to the last word in the list, which prevents us from adding an additional gap width, basic gap width. However, we have to counteract this by adding that word in at the very end after we've completed the looping process, the iterative process of going through the list. And by doing that, in order to accomplish this, we simply add to the formatted string variable that final word. And in order to get that final word, we must say wordlist.get at what index? Well, it might be different for every example. Well, what isn't different in every example is to get the final element in a list, you say the word list.size -1, that always represents the last index position in the array list or list, okay? So that fixes everything now. And thank you for sharing your solution as well there, Matthew. All right, so that wraps things up. That wraps things up for today. I'm going to share my, Tamim, I gotcha. So that's my code. If you want to take a look at it, we could take a look at Tamim's real quick, and I'll keep presenting so we can all look at it together. All right, so we're looking at Tanmim's code now. Remember, Tanmim, I don't believe I'm allowed to edit. It like crashes when I try to edit. So what wasn't working, Tanmim? Or what's not working? Got it, part C. Leftover spaces, gap width, gap, I. Tanmim, right here, line 37. You're doing I++, but you're using A. Do you see that? Right here in your loop. A is assigned to 0, A is less than gap width, I++. Make that A++. Try it now, Tanmim. All right, seems to be working now, Tanmim. No problem. Just be careful with doing that. I've made that type of mistake as well in the past. Just be careful when you, if you're using some type of nested loop and you copy the outer loop, you know, for formatting purposes for your inner loop, right? You're going to want to use a different variable. So just make sure, you know, you're careful with your variable naming structure on that inner loop. Yeah, I mean, Matthew, we have, so let's see. We've done all of the method and controlled structures questions except all but one. We've done all of the array questions. We've done, so there's 4 questions that we haven't done, at least in terms of the review. Of the 4 questions that we have left, we've definitely done at least 1 or 2 of those together much earlier in the year when we were on that specific topic. So it's not to say that, you know, we haven't, you know, we're going to be missing something. So what I think we should do is 2017, number 1. Good. And you should. Yep, exactly, Tanmim. So let's see. I think we should do 2017, number 1. AP CSA FRQ. I think we should do, let's see, number 1. Yeah, it involves a Boolean. It's a little different. All right, so 2017 number 1, we will go over tomorrow at noon. How's that sound? Yes, that's the digits one, Matthew. Yes, 2017 number 1. And by due, I'm not counting. I didn't count today's assignment for a grade, and I'm not going to count tomorrow's because I understand some people are taking other AP exams. So I'll eventually make these questions due as homework after the AP weeks are over. So just so we have some homework assignments. So if you've done them already, you're good to go. So, you know, like 2 weeks from now or a week and a half from now when all the AP exams are over, I'll repost it and you could submit your work